If you are just joining me, let me set the table for you quickly, because you have arrived at the very best part, and I do not want you to be lost. Click the link on the screen for the full backstory if you have not heard it already. My name is Vivian Hartwell. 50 years ago, with my late husband and my grandmother's recipe, I built a company from my own kitchen table into a name that people across this country trusted. And in my old age, a board of directors led by a smooth and greedy man named Richard Vance quietly conspired to steal it from me. They engineered false losses to make my healthy company look like it was failing. They arranged a cheap sale to their own friends that would have made them rich and left me, the founder, with almost nothing. And on the morning I am about to tell you about, I sat at the head of my own boardroom table, 78 years old and utterly powerless, waiting to watch 11 men vote away 50 years of my life. And then the doors opened, and my grandson walked in, Sam. My son Peter's quiet boy, 22 years old, 3 weeks out of business school, in a suit I had never seen him wear, carrying a slim leather briefcase. The board laughed at him. They asked if the child was lost. And my grandson set that briefcase down on the table and told them, calm as a still pond, that before anyone cast a single vote, they had better understand that the ownership of Hartwell and Company was no longer what any of them believed it to be. That is where we ended part 1. And tonight, I am going to tell you everything. Tonight, you are going to learn exactly what was inside that briefcase. You are going to learn what my quiet grandson had been doing, in total secrecy, for 2 long years while everyone underestimated him. You are going to watch a boy of 22 bring 11 powerful men to ruin, one calm sentence at a time. And you are going to see the moment, the exact moment, that the smile died on Richard Vance's face forever. Stay with me all the way to the end, because the last thing my grandson did in that room, the thing he did for me, is the reason I am able to tell you this story from the comfort of a home that is still mine. Let me take you back into that boardroom, to the silence after my grandson spoke, and to the sound of a slim leather briefcase clicking open. For a moment after Sam spoke, no one in that room moved. The chuckling had stopped. Richard Vance, at the far end of the table, recovered first, the way men like him always do, and he put on a tolerant smile and told my grandson that this was a closed meeting of the board, that the young man had no standing to be here, and that he should leave before security was called. He was still certain, you see. He still believed he was dealing with a boy. I want to tell you what it was like to watch my grandson in those first few seconds, because I had known this child his whole life, and I had never once seen the person who now stood in that room. Sam had always been quiet, and I had always, God forgive me, half mistaken his quiet for softness, the way the whole world mistakes quiet for softness. But the young man standing at the middle of that table was not soft. He was the calmest thing in the room, and his calm was not the calm of a boy who does not understand his danger. It was the calm of a man who has prepared so thoroughly, and for so long, that there is simply nothing left in the room that can surprise him. I have seen that kind of calm exactly twice in my life. Once in my Thomas, on the worst night our young business ever faced, and once in that boardroom, in my grandson, and I understood, watching him, that the boy had grown into his grandfather, while I was too busy grieving to notice. And my grandson, without raising his voice at all, told Richard Vance that he had every standing in the world, and that if Vance would give him 90 seconds, he would explain exactly why, and that if at the end of those 90 seconds the board still wished to call security, he would leave without a fuss. He said it so reasonably, so completely without fear, that the room, out of sheer curiosity, let him speak. That was Vance's first mistake of the morning, and it would not be his last. He gave my grandson 90 seconds. My grandson only needed about 30. Sam opened the briefcase, and he took out a single sheet of paper, and he slid it down the length of that long, polished table toward Richard Vance, the way Vance and his people had slid so many papers toward me over the years. And as it traveled, my grandson explained what it was. It was, he told them, a record of ownership. A current one, as of 9 o'clock that morning, and then he told the room what it showed, and I want you to understand it the way I finally came to understand it, because it is the whole of how my grandson saved us. You will remember that over 50 years, as my company grew, I had sold shares of it to investors. a piece at a time, until I owned less than half. Well, the board members held large pieces of their own, enough that together they could outvote me. But here is the thing that they, in all their cleverness, had entirely forgotten. Not all the shares of Hartwell and Company were held by the people in that room. Over 5 decades, many small pieces of my company had been sold to small investors, ordinary people, some of them long dead and passed down to children who barely knew what they held. Old friends, early believers, a retired foreman who had taken shares instead of a bonus in 1981. Dozens of them scattered and forgotten, each holding a small sliver, none of them ever invited to a meeting, none of them ever courted, because the board considered them too small to matter. Sleeping shares in sleeping hands that everyone had stopped counting years ago. My grandson had counted them. That was what those 2 years of quiet questions had been. That was why he had wanted the old share records, the dusty founding papers, the names no one else remembered. While the board looked down the table at an old woman they had already beaten, my grandson had spent 2 years finding every one of those forgotten shareholders, one by one. He had written to them, he had traveled to see them, on his student's budget, sitting at their kitchen tables the way I once sat at mine, explaining to them, honestly, what was being done to the company they had believed in, and to the woman who had built it. He told me about some of them, later, and I wept to hear it. There was the widow of that old foreman who had taken shares instead of a bonus in 1981, an ancient woman in a nursing home 3 states away, who had held on to those shares for 40 years because her husband had told her, on his deathbed, that Vivian Hartwell was the finest person he had ever worked for and that she must never sell. My grandson found her. He sat with her for a whole afternoon and listened to her stories about my Thomas, and when he told her what the board was doing to me, she signed her shares over to him on the spot and told him that her herald would rise up out of his grave if she did anything else. There was a man in his 60s who had inherited a tiny sliver from a father he barely remembered, and who did not even know he owned a piece of a company until my grandson knocked on his door and explained it. There were dozens of them, scattered across the country, ordinary people holding ordinary slivers, and my grandson went to every single one, because he had understood the thing that the clever men in the boardroom never could. He had understood that those forgotten people were not too small to matter. He had understood that they were the whole game. And one by one, those forgotten people, who remembered what Hartwell and Company had once meant, had agreed to let my grandson vote their shares. Some sold their slivers to him outright, for what savings a young man could scrape together and borrow. Many simply signed over their proxy, their voice, to the quiet young man who was the only person in 50 years who had ever bothered to come and ask them what they thought. Not one of them said no, not one, because people remember decency, you see. People hold on to it for 40 years in a drawer, waiting for the day it matters. That is the thing greed can never account for on its spreadsheets. He had gathered them, all those sleeping slivers, patiently, secretly, into one place. And when you added those forgotten shares to my own, which my grandson also now held the proxy to vote, because of course the very first person he had quietly secured was me, though I had signed his papers without ever fully understanding what I was signing, trusting him the way you trust family. When you added it all together, the arithmetic of that boardroom was no longer 11 against 1. It was a controlling voice, and it belonged to my grandson. I need to stop here and make sure you feel the full weight of what my grandson had accomplished, because when I finally understood it, sitting in that boardroom, it took my breath away, and I want it to take yours. For 3 years, the board's entire power had rested on a single fact, which was that together they could always outvote me. That was the whole foundation of their scheme. It was the reason they could push me aside, engineer the losses, force the sale. 11 votes against 1. It was arithmetic. And arithmetic does not care how right you are or how hard you built. And my grandson, without firing a shot, without a single dollar of the kind of money those men respected, had simply gone out and quietly changed the arithmetic. He had reached into the forgotten corners of my own company, into drawers and nursing homes and the memories of loyal old men, and he had gathered up all the sleeping power that everyone else was too arrogant to bother with, and he had brought it into that room in a slim leather briefcase. The foundation the board had stood on for 3 years was gone, and they had not felt it go, because they had been looking down the table at an old woman the entire time, congratulating themselves, while the floor was quietly removed from beneath their feet. The paper reached Richard Vance. I watched him pick it up. I watched his eyes move down it, and I watched, in the great mirror of that polished table, the color drain slowly out of a face I had watched wear false sorrow for 3 years. Because Richard Vance was many wicked things, but he was not stupid, and it took him only a moment to understand that the boy he had just threatened to have removed by security now held more voting power in that room than every person at that table combined. The sale they had come to approve could not pass, not without my grandson, and my grandson was quite obviously not going to approve the theft of his own grandmother's company. I saw the exact instant the truth reached him, because his hand, holding that single sheet of paper, began, very slightly, to tremble. For 3 years that man had made my hands tremble in that room, and now at last it was his turn, and I confess to you, God forgive an old woman, that I watched his hand shake and I felt something in my chest that I can only call justice. The room erupted. Voices talking over one another, demands to see the documents, accusations that this could not possibly be legal, a great deal of noise from men who had been perfectly quiet a moment before, when they thought they were the ones with the power. And my grandson simply stood there in the middle of it, calm as ever, and waited for them to exhaust themselves, because he had one more thing in that briefcase, and he was in no hurry at all. When the noise finally died down, my grandson told them that the matter of the ownership was settled and not open to debate, and that they were welcome to have their lawyers confirm every word of it, which they would find to be exactly as he had said. And then he told them that he wanted to talk, now, about the losses. And he opened that briefcase again. I have told you that I knew, in my bones, that my company was not truly failing. I had seen the pattern in those late nights with my lamp and my magnifying glass. The strange suppliers, the wasteful contracts, the warehouse sold off cheap to a friend of Vance. I had seen it, but I had not been able to prove it, and I certainly had not been able to stop it. Well, my grandson had not only seen it, my grandson had spent 2 years documenting it, with the patience of a boy who knew that suspicion is nothing and proof is everything. One by one, he laid the papers on that table. He laid out the contracts awarded to suppliers that charged 3 times the going rate, and beside each one, he laid the record showing that those suppliers were secretly owned by the very board members who had voted to hire them. He laid out the consulting fees, enormous ones, paid to firms that turned out to share an address with Richard Vance's brother-in-law. He laid out the sale of my 30-year warehouse, at a fraction of its worth, to a company that led, through 3 careful layers, straight back to Vance himself. And as he laid each paper down, he named it, quietly, for the whole room to hear, and I watched the faces of the other 10 board members as their private thefts were spoken aloud one after another in front of their colleagues. I watched a man named Delgado go white when my grandson laid down the record of a trucking contract that led back to his wife's company. I watched 2 others refuse to look at each other, having clearly each believed that only he had been clever enough to steal so quietly. That was the other thing my grandson understood, you see. Thieves who conspire together do not trust one another, not really, and the fastest way to break them is to show each of them, all at once, exactly how much you know about all of them. He was not only exposing them to me and to the law, he was exposing them to each other, and I could see the alliance that Richard Vance had built over 6 patient years beginning to crack right there at the table, each man suddenly calculating, behind his frightened eyes, how to save himself. He laid out the whole rotten machine of it, every gear and lever, the entire apparatus by which 11 men had quietly drained a healthy company and called the draining a decline. He had it all: dates, signatures, the paper trail of a robbery, assembled and bound and copied, my grandson told them, with copies already held safely by others, in case anyone in the room was thinking of making documents disappear. And then my grandson told them what was going to happen, and this is the part where I finally understood that the quiet boy I had underestimated all his life was, in fact, the most formidable person I had ever known. He gave them a choice. He did not shout it. He did not gloat. He laid it before them as plainly as a man laying down cards. They could fight him, he said. They could contest the ownership and drag it through the courts, and in the meantime he would take everything on that table, every document of their fraud, to the other shareholders, to the authorities who concern themselves with exactly this kind of theft, and to anyone else with an interest in seeing justice done. And they would lose, because the proof was overwhelming, and when they lost, they would lose not only the company, but their reputations, and quite possibly their freedom. That was the first choice. Or, he said, or they could resign. Today, all of them who had been part of it. They could resign quietly from the board, effective immediately, and they could return what they had taken, every improperly awarded contract unwound, the warehouse bought back, the drained value restored to the company, down to the last dollar. And in exchange, my grandson would not pursue them. He would let them walk away, poorer and disgraced among the small circle of people who would know, but free. He called it a mercy they did not deserve, and he was right, and he offered it anyway, because, he told them, his grandmother had built this company on decency, and he would not begin his stewardship of it with a bloodbath, however much they had earned one. I have thought about that choice many times since, about why my grandson offered them a way out when he so plainly held the power to destroy them, and I have decided that it was the wisest thing he did all morning, wiser even than the 2 years of preparation, because a cornered animal with nothing to lose will fight to the death, and a long and public court battle, however certain its outcome, would have dragged the company's name through years of scandal and drained it of the very strength my grandson was trying to save. By offering the thieves a door, he made it in their own selfish interest to go quietly, to unwind their thefts, to restore the company rather than burn it down on their way out. He did not offer them mercy because he was soft. He offered them mercy because it was the surest way to protect the thing he had come to save. That is the difference between anger and strategy, and my grandson, at 22, understood it better than men 4 times his age. I want you to understand what I felt watching this. I had walked into that room a defeated old woman, ready to grieve. And now I sat, my grandmother's brooch pinned to my collar, and watched my grandson, my son's quiet boy, dismantle 11 powerful men with nothing but patience, preparation, and the truth. I did not feel triumphant, exactly. It was deeper than triumph. It was the feeling of watching something you built with your whole life be pulled back from the edge of a cliff by hands you did not even know were strong. It was the feeling of not being alone after all, when you had been so certain that you were. And underneath even that, there was a stranger feeling, one I have thought about a great deal since. As I watched my grandson lay down that ultimatum, I felt my whole understanding of the last 3 years turn over inside me, the way the world had looked upside down in the mirror of that table. Every night I had lain awake believing I was watching my life be stolen while no one came. Every time I had felt the loneliness of being old and right and disbelieved. Every moment I had doubted my own clear mind because 11 people told me I was confused. And all that while, all that long and lonely while, my grandson had been out there in the dark, at those kitchen tables, building this. I had not been alone. I had only felt alone, which is a different thing entirely, and the difference between them, I understood in that boardroom, is the whole distance between despair and hope. I had been loved and defended the entire time. I simply had not been able to see it yet, and I made myself a promise, watching him, that I would never again mistake the silence of the people who love me for their absence. They chose to resign. Of course they did. Faced with ruin on one side and a quiet exit on the other, men like that always choose the exit, because men like that have always, at bottom, been cowards, which is the thing that decent people forget about them. Richard Vance was the last to break. He tried, at the very end, the thing they always try. He turned to me, and he abandoned the sorrowful mask entirely, and he told me that I did not understand what I was doing, that the boy was reckless, that they had been trying to save the company, that I would regret this. And I looked at Richard Vance, this man who had spent 3 years teaching me to doubt my own mind, and I finally said the thing I had wanted to say for 3 years. I told him that I understood perfectly, that I had understood for longer than he knew, and that the only thing I regretted was ever having trusted a man who could look at 50 years of honest work and see nothing but something to steal. Then I asked him to leave my boardroom, and he did. But I will tell you the small moment inside that large one that I treasure most, because it is so very human. As Richard Vance gathered his papers with shaking hands, he could not stop himself from turning, one last time, to my grandson and demanding to know how a boy his age had done all of this, how a nobody 3 weeks out of school had beaten him. He asked it with real bewilderment, the bewilderment of a man who has spent his whole life believing that cleverness and cruelty are the same thing and has just been proven wrong by someone who possessed only one of the two. And my grandson looked at him, and he did not gloat, and he did not sneer. He simply told Richard Vance the truth. He told him that he had done it by caring about the people Vance had been too important to notice, that while Vance was counting his own shares, my grandson had been counting people, and that this, in the end, was the whole of the difference between them. Richard Vance had no answer to that. There is no answer to that. And he left my boardroom a smaller man than he had entered it, which is exactly what he was, and always had been, underneath the good suit. They filed out, all of them who had been part of it, and the room that had been so crowded and so certain grew quiet and half-empty. And when the last of them was gone, my grandson finally set down the briefcase and turned to me, and for the first time all morning, the calm and formidable man was gone, and he was simply my grandson again, a young man looking at his grandmother with his heart in his eyes, asking me, quietly, if I was all right. I was not all right. I was weeping, in the chair I had sat in for 40 years, in the boardroom I had thought I had lost forever. But I was weeping the way you weep when a thing is saved, not when it is lost, and there is all the difference in the world between those two kinds of tears. I stood up, my old legs shaking, and I took my grandson's face in my 2 hands, the same way I had once taken my children's faces when I sent them off to chase their dreams, and I could not find a single word large enough for what I felt, so I just held his face and I wept, and he put his arms around his grandmother and held me up, in the room where I had built my whole life, which he had just handed back to me. And over his shoulder, through my tears, I could see the old black and white photograph still hanging on the wall, me and my Thomas in front of our first storefront, and I swear to you that I felt my husband in that room, standing with us, and I told him silently, "We did it, my love. The family did it. The thing we built is safe." Now, I promised you the whole story, and there is more, because saving a company is not the same as running one, and my grandson knew that better than anyone. In the weeks that followed, the truth of the company came out into the light, and it was exactly as I had always known in my bones. Hartwell and Company was not failing. It had never been failing. Once the fraud was unwound, once the drained value was restored, and the sham contracts were canceled, and the money that had been quietly bleeding into 11 pockets was stopped, my company stood revealed as what it had always been underneath the lies. Healthy, profitable, strong. The losses had been a costume, and when my grandson tore the costume away, there stood the good and thriving business that I had built, blinking in the sunlight, entirely alive. I cannot tell you what it did to me, in those weeks, to walk back through my own factory with my head held high. For 3 years I had crept through that place like a ghost, watching familiar faces disappear, feeling the life being choked out of the thing I loved, and being told all the while that I was imagining it. Now I walked the floor again as myself, and the workers who remembered me came up and shook my hand with tears in their eyes, and I learned that many of them had known, or suspected, that something was rotten, and had felt as powerless as I had. We had all been made to feel alone and mad and helpless, every one of us, from the founder at the top to the line workers at the bottom, by the same small handful of greedy men. And now it was over, and the building itself seemed to breathe easier, and I am not ashamed to tell you that I stood in the middle of my factory floor one afternoon and wept, surrounded by people who understood exactly why. My grandson rebuilt the board with honest people. He found them carefully, the way I once hired carefully, people who understood that a company is its workers and its customers and its name, not a carcass to be carved. He brought back some of the good people who had been pushed out, the loyal ones, the ones who knew the difference between a good jar and a bad one. He tracked down a plant manager who had been forced into early retirement 2 years earlier, a woman who had given the company 25 years, and he asked her to come back and helped her understand that she had been pushed out precisely because she was too honest to go along. And she came back, and she wept in my office, and we held each other like the survivors of the same shipwreck, which is what we were. And my grandson took up the leadership of Hartwell and Company himself at 22 years old, not because he had been handed it, but because he had earned it, in the only way that truly counts, by being the one who showed up when it mattered. But here is the thing my grandson did, that I will love him for until the day I die, and past it. He did not have to think about me at all, once the company was his to run. A lesser person, even a good one, might have saved the company and simply set the old founder gently aside, with thanks and a pension, the way the board had always wanted to. My grandson did the opposite. He came to me, and he told me that he did not want to run Hartwell and Company without me. He asked me to stay, he restored my shares to their proper worth, made certain I held a meaningful piece of the company I had built, and arranged that I would receive, for the rest of my life, a true and honest income from the thing my hands had made, enough to live well and lack for nothing, not as charity, but as what I was owed. He put my name back where it belonged, at the head of the company, as founder and chair, and he asked me, this boy of 22, if I would teach him, if I would sit with him, the way I once sat with Alma boiling fruit at 2 a.m, and show him everything I knew about how you build a thing that lasts. I asked him, once, in a quiet moment after it was all over, why he had done it, why he had given up 2 years of his young life, in secret, telling no one, taking on powerful and dangerous men, for a company he had never wanted to run, and a business he could easily have walked away from. He could have done anything with that brilliant mind. He could have gone to any bank, any firm, and made himself rich and comfortable and safe. Why this? Why me? And my grandson was quiet for a long moment, the old watchful quiet, and then he told me something I will carry to my grave. He told me that when he was a small boy, he had once heard me on the telephone, late at night, encouraging his father, my Peter, to chase his music, to not be afraid, to follow the thing that lit him up, even though it would never make him rich. And Sam said he had understood, even as a child, that most grandmothers would have pushed their son toward the family money, toward the safe and sensible thing, and that his had done the opposite, had given her own children away to their dreams, and had done it with joy. He said he had decided, that night, listening at the top of the stairs, that a woman who would love her children, that freely deserved to be protected fiercely. He had just had to grow up first, and learn how. That is why he studied what he studied. That is why he was ready when the wolves came. He had been getting ready, in his quiet way, since he was a little boy at the top of the stairs. So that is what we did, that is what we do still. An old woman and her grandson, running the company she built, side by side, he with his sharp modern mind and I with 50 years of knowing where the bodies are buried. And it is, I promise you, the happiest work of my entire long life. We have an arrangement, my grandson and I. Every Tuesday morning, before the offices fill up, we sit together in my old boardroom, just the two of us, with coffee, and I tell him a story from the 50 years of building the place. Sometimes it is a business lesson, how I learned to read a supplier, how I knew when to grow and when to hold. And sometimes it is just a story, about Alma, about his grandfather, about the night 4 kitchens on our little street boiled fruit until dawn. And my grandson, who could run circles around me in matters of finance and law, sits and listens to every one of them with that same quiet attention that saved us all, and writes things down, because he says the recipes are the easy part, and the hard part, the part they do not teach in any school, is knowing why the thing you are building is worth building at all. I have put the old black and white photograph of me and Thomas back in its place of honor, right at the center of the boardroom wall, where every new honest board member can see it, so that no one who ever sits at that table again forgets that this company was built by 2 young people, with nothing but a recipe and each other, and that it is not a carcass to be carved, but a living thing, made by hand, held in trust, and loved. My daughter Claire came home from the sea for a whole month when it was over, and my son Peter came too, and they were horrified to learn how close they had come to losing their mother's life's work, and ashamed that they had been too far away to help. But I took their faces in my hands, the way I always have, and I told them that they had helped, more than they could ever know, because the son I set free to chase his music had raised the grandson who saved us all. The freedom was never a weakness in this family. It was the strength. It just took a generation to come around. So now you know. Now you know what was inside that slim leather briefcase. Not a weapon, not a threat, just the truth, gathered patiently over 2 years by a quiet young man who loved his grandmother, and who understood that the most powerful thing in any room full of liars is a person holding the proof. My grandson did not save my company with money, or with force, or with rage. He saved it with attention, and with patience, and with the willingness to sit at forgotten people's kitchen tables and ask them what they thought. He beat 11 powerful men because he did the one thing they were far too important to do. He counted the people everyone else had stopped counting, including me, and now you know why I have told you this story in 2 parts, and why it matters more to me than any of the others. Because for 3 years I believed I was alone. I believed that the price of setting my children free, of telling them to chase their dreams instead of chaining themselves to my company, was that when the wolves finally came, there would be no one of my own blood to stand between me and them. I believed my own goodness had left me undefended. I could not have been more wrong. Because I set my children free, they grew into free people, and free people raise free children, and one of those free children grew up watching his grandmother with quiet, loving eyes, and chose, entirely of his own will, out of nothing but love, to become exactly the person I needed, in the exact moment I needed him. The freedom I gave away came back for me. It came back wearing a suit I had never seen, carrying a briefcase, 3 weeks out of school. The very thing I thought had left me defenseless turned out to be my defense. Here is what I want to say to you before I go, because I believe someone listening tonight needs to hear it. If you are old and you feel powerless, and you are watching something you built be taken by people who are counting on you to be too tired and too trusting to stop them, I want you to remember Hartwell and Company. I want you to remember that greed always underestimates love, because greed cannot understand it, and that is the crack in every wicked plan ever made. The people who scheme in boardrooms and around deathbeds and at dinner tables, they count on you being alone, but you may not be as alone as you fear. Sometimes the rescue is already on its way, from a direction you never thought to watch, wearing a face you have loved since it was small. Pay attention to the quiet ones in your family. Tell them your troubles. You never know which of them is listening the way a general listens, out of love, preparing to stand between you and the wolves. And I want to say one more thing to those of you who are younger, who have a mother or a father or a grandparent that the world has started to speak over and around, as though they were already gone. Go and sit at their kitchen table. Ask them about their life, the whole of it, the folding tables and the 2 in the morning and the recipes handed down. Not because it is your duty, but because there is treasure there, real treasure, in the memory of people who built things with their hands, and because one day you may be the only one who was paying enough attention to save them. My grandson saved my company because he had listened to me, truly listened, for years, when everyone else had decided I was a problem to be managed. Listening was his whole weapon. It is available to every single one of you, and it costs nothing but your time, and it is worth more than every clever man in every boardroom in the world. And to my grandson, if he ever watches this, I will only say what I said in that boardroom, when I had no words large enough and simply held his face in my hands. Thank you. Your grandfather would have been so proud he could not have spoken, and so am I. So tell me in the comments, who is the quiet one in your family, the one who pays attention, the one you would trust to stand between you and the wolves? I read every single one. If you believe that love is stronger than greed and that a family set free will always find its way back, then stay with me and subscribe, and I will see you at the next one. Thank you for sitting with me tonight, for both parts of my story. There is always a place for you here, and I will keep it warm.